In this video, we're going to talk about what econometrics is all about. The word econometrics is derived from two words with Greek roots that together mean economic measurement. And that's essentially what econometrics is all about. There are three broad ways in which we might use econometric analysis. One is to estimate the magnitude of the relationships that might exist among economic variables. Typically, economic models predict the direction of the effect, but don't tell you how large the effects will be. We can estimate the magnitude of the effect using econometric techniques. We also have a whole variety of economic models that generate specific predictions about how people will respond to changing costs or benefits. Those models generate predictions about what will happen, but we really need to see if the behavior that we observe in the real world matches the predictions of theory. We're testing the hypotheses generated by economic models to see whether the behavior we observe in the real world is consistent with the model predictions. And a third use of econometric analysis is to generate predictions of what will happen in the future in response to some policy change or to some other shock to a system. Econometric analysis is not used only by economists, although one of the main groups who use econometric techniques is in fact economists. It's also used by market researchers who are interested in generating predictions about what factors influence individuals' decisions to buy anything. And the basic tools that we'll be developing in this class can be used and are used regularly by market researchers to analyze consumer behavior. Financial analysts use econometric analysis to generate predictions of how financial markets will respond to various shocks, or how individuals will respond in their behavior in financial markets. Policy analysts use econometric analysis to examine how changes in policy will impact the economy or some aspect of the economy. Among the econometric tools that economists have developed are hazard models and survival rate models that predict how long someone might live and what factors might influence that. Those basic tools are used by biologists in a wide variety of applications. Medical researchers also use econometric analysis to predict how people respond to policy changes or to investigate risk factors in terms of human mortality and a wide variety of other factors. Similarly, epidemiologists use econometric tools to try to model how individuals will respond to risks associated with, for example, a pandemic, and how people respond to changing circumstances during a pandemic, how people will alter their behavior in response to changes in the risk of death or illness. Historians also have, in the last several decades, begun to use econometric analysis to analyze the past. Large amounts of historical data have been encoded digitally and are now being analyzed by economic historians who use that data to help us understand the past more effectively. That branch of econometrics is referred to as cliometrics in honor of Clio, who is the Greek muse of history. Demographers examine the characteristics of populations, and they use econometric techniques to analyze things like changing fertility rates, changing marriage rates, changing divorce rates, family formation, family location, migration decisions, and a whole host of other factors. Political scientists use econometric analysis to analyze voting participation and voting behavior, and the determinants of voting decisions, and the role that economic and socioeconomic factors play in influencing people's participation in the political process. Psychologists use econometric analysis, particularly social psychologists, in those circumstances where they're not able to engage in the type of controlled experiments that psychologists generally prefer to do. Because quite often it's not possible to design controlled experiments and you have to rely on population data. And psychologists use the same tools that economists do when dealing with large publicly available data sets. Sociologists also use econometric techniques for similar purposes, as do anthropologists. Urban planners use econometric analysis to help predict changes in urban population and urban incomes, or the impact of various policy changes that might be introduced in an urban environment. Market analysts who are trying to analyze a variety of markets and sell their services to firms also use econometric techniques in making forecasts of the future. Last but not least, nonprofit organizations often use econometric techniques to try to estimate what factors will influence people's participation in donating to their organizations, as well as in evaluating the effectiveness of various programs that they might be considering providing funding for. Let's talk about each of those uses of econometrics in just a little bit more detail. In terms of estimating the magnitude of quantitative relationships, there's a variety of market models from perfect competition up to monopoly, and each of those generate certain predictions about how firms will be responding to changing circumstances. Similarly, we have various models of the economics of education. There's a human capital model that argues that an increase in education raises an individual's productivity, which results in higher earnings. An alternative model, though, is a signaling model, which suggests that education sorts people into more productive and less productive individuals, but doesn't actually raise anyone's productivity. Each of those models generate certain predictions about behavior, and we can use econometric techniques to evaluate those models and see which is more consistent with the behavior that we observe. In macroeconomics, we have monetarist models, we have new Keynesian models, we have new classical models, each of which has different predictions about how people respond to shocks in government spending or in the money supply or other factors. We can use econometric techniques to see which models fit the world most effectively, which models generate predictions that are in accordance with observed behavior. We also have to be concerned with economic significance. Economic models predict the direction in which some variables will change when there's a change in some other variables, but we need to know how large those effects are. For example, economic theory predicts that an increase in taxes could lead to a reduction in labor supply. What matters is how large a change there might be. If a 10% increase in the tax rate leads to a 0.01% reduction in labor supply, that's not going to have much of an impact on the economy. But if it results in a 5% reduction in the quantity of labor supplied, that's an effect that we would have to be more concerned with. So we're not just interested in the direction of effects, we're also interested in whether the effects are large enough to be meaningful in an economic sense. We already talked a little bit about how market research would estimate how responsive consumers are to various advertising campaigns, but market researchers might also try to estimate things like the price elasticity of demand, the cross-price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand, so that firms can predict what will happen to the sales in response to changing prices of their good, prices of related goods, and changing economic conditions in general. One factor that might be of interest to you, and certainly of interest to society as a whole, is how large the payoff is to a college degree. We can use econometric techniques to estimate the rate of return to a college degree, and that's one of the things we'll be looking at this semester. And in terms of government policy, people are interested in knowing how alternative policies will impact the economy. Let's take some examples. Suppose we introduce a carbon tax. We're interested in knowing to what extent that will affect carbon emissions and to what extent it will affect GDP, per capita income, and a host of other variables. We might compare that to the impact of subsidies for green energy, for solar energy, and similar factors. And we might want to know which of those factors would have the largest net benefit to society. Pretty much any policy that you can think of is going to generate some benefits and costs. Econometric techniques can be used to estimate the magnitude of those benefits and costs. In terms of testing economic hypotheses, essentially what we're trying to do is compare our economic theories with the real world and to see if the economic models and the mathematical models developed by economists actually reflect the behavior that people exhibit in the real world. And we're interested in knowing whether a given change has an impact and also whether that effect is going to be positive or negative. Because, for example, there are some things where we can't a priori predict the sign of an effect. Let's take the case of a minimum wage. If labor markets are perfectly competitive, then an increase in the minimum wage would result in increased unemployment, particularly for teenagers. However, if firms have some degree of monopsony power, then it's possible that an increase in the minimum wage might actually lead to more employment. So we're going to be interested in determining not only whether there is an effect of the minimum wage on employment, but whether that effect is significantly positive or significantly negative. And we'll define those terms in much more detail over the next few chapters. The last role that we mentioned was predicting future outcomes. Certainly, there's a booming business in economic forecasting for firms who are interested in trying to make plans for the future, on the part of the government trying to determine the impact of changes in taxes and spending programs and other policy innovations, as well as international agencies and non-governmental organizations are interested in predicting what's going to happen in the future so they can plan for various contingencies. And there's also a branch of economics called forensic economics, which is used to assess the damages that occur in response to injuries. For example, forensic economists will generate estimates of how much income was lost in cases of economic discrimination, or they can generate predictions of how much income is lost in wrongful death or wrongful injury cases. So forensic economists actually use econometric techniques to forecast what losses are received in the event of some type of harm that is compensated through the legal system. We'll talk more about this in future videos.